Oh.
So, now, okay, you're on.
Okay, welcome everyone to our fourth and final week on the Gospel of Luke, a series I have entitled So That You May Know the Truth, which is taken from the preface to the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 1, verse 4. The picture here comes from the Book of Kells, which is the Irish, one of Ireland's most prized possessions. And I'm reminded of Dublin today, where the Book of Kells is, because my hometown Steelers are playing in Dublin today at 9 a.m. So they have already started the game and are playing the Minnesota Vikings. So I'll check the score here in a minute. Anyhow, this is the fourth session. We're going to try and wrap up our consideration of the Gospel of Luke. I'm going to go back and I'm going to tell you the title of this. We're going to be dealing with the end of Jesus' life, starting with chapter 19. But I want to put this into context for you by looking at the outline of the Gospel. We did this last week, but I want to show you where we are here. Week number 1, we did the introduction. Week number 2 and number 3, we did the public ministry of Jesus, which begins in Galilee in the north. But then I made the point that in 951, Jesus begins a 10-chapter journey to Jerusalem. And that's where a lot of unique material in the Gospel of Luke occurs. So many of the very famous parables of Jesus, the parable of Good Samaritan, the parable of Prodigal Son, the rich man and Lazarus, all of those parables are in that unique section of the Gospel of Luke. Well, Jesus is going to draw near and enter Jerusalem starting in 1928. And then we're going to see those events related to the passion of Jesus, and finally in chapter 24, the resurrection and appearances of Jesus according to Luke's gospel. And the material that is in bold there are the things that we're going to deal with today. So I've got a lot of material to cover, and I've got to give you some background information that will put that into context for you as well. That's what we're going to do. We're going to deal with this latter part of the Gospel of Luke. And what I'm going to do is try and highlight what's distinctively different from the other gospel accounts. I will refer to some of the things that are commonalities. You're familiar with the general story, but I want to show you what's unique about Luke's version of this. Just like this section here, the travel to the journey to Jerusalem, is unique to the Gospel of Luke. There are elements of all of the rest of the Gospel of Luke that are found only in the Gospel. But to begin, I want to give you some background that's important background for you to understand this section. And this is going to deal with the sects within Jewish Palestinian Judaism of the first century. And I always had to, when I was teaching, I had to be really careful when I talked about Jewish sects, because that's not always what my students heard. So I always had to write it out and then pronounce it very, very clearly. Although people really did pick up when I said we're going to talk about Jewish sects. That was not what I was really talking about. Anyhow, there are actually several major groups. You're familiar with the Pharisees, I'm sure. Pharisees are noted throughout the New Testament. The Pharisees, though, just to be very clear, the Pharisees' base of power was the local synagogue. And synagogues were found in most towns in Israel. The leaders of those synagogues were teachers called rabbis. Okay? That would be distinguished from another group, the Sadducees. The Sadducees were not in the countryside. They controlled Jerusalem. And they controlled Jerusalem, and what was in Jerusalem is the temple in Jerusalem. That is not the synagogue. And I want to be very clear about that. Today we end up confusing those two terms. We talk about temple and synagogue sort of synonymously. They are not synonyms in the New Testament. There is only one temple. That temple is in Jerusalem. There are many, many synagogues. Okay? The Sadducees were called chief priests, are the ones that control the temple. They also controlled the council, which was called the Sanhedrin. And it was the religious, it was sort of the supreme court and legislative body of Israel. Rome allowed them, even though Rome was in control, Rome allowed the Sanhedrin to control the religious life of Israel. Rome didn't want anything to do with religion and religious life. So they allowed Jews to rule themselves in terms of their religious laws. There are other groups that we know about, not mentioned in the New Testament, the Essenes. We do know them from early literature. Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, mentions them. But they are the ones who were located at Qumran, and that was excavated in Israel in the 1940s. And because that community is near the Dead Sea, and what was found near the Dead Sea were called scrolls, in their great creativity, biblical scholars came up with the designation Dead Sea Scrolls. They belong to the Essenes, and they give us an idea of who the Essenes were. That's a monastic sect that lived by the Dead Sea in Qumran. There was another group called Zealots. They were a revolutionary kind of group, and they wanted to bring about revolution by trying to overthrow Rome. And they would carry in their tunics a sword, or a dagger really, called a sicarii. And they would go through crowds, and they would pull out their dagger, and they would try and stab Roman soldiers to kill them. Some people think Judas Iscariot might have been a zealot. And one of Jesus' own disciples is called Simon the Zealot. So there is some kind of influence on Jesus' inner circle in the Zealots. But most people belong to a category called the Am Haaretz, which is in fact, the translation literally means people of the land. And these are the nominal Jews. These are sort of parties or groups, sects, sort of formal, but relatively small in number. The vast majority of Jews were Am Haaretz, unaffiliated. They weren't Pharisees. They weren't Zealots. They weren't Sadducees. They sort of kept the law. They sort of did the various things like kept Passover and things like that. But they were not these kinds of highly organized people like these are. Okay, I want to give you a little bit of history here. I've talked about the year 70 CE, which is a major year in ancient Israelite history. It starts, though, in 66. The Jews end up revolting against Rome in 66. Romans come to Jerusalem. They think they can take the money that is in the temple treasury. And so they send a small contingent of forces to take the temple treasury by force. Well, they are rebuffed by Jews, the police and the like, in Jerusalem. And Israel interprets that as a sign from God that it's time to throw off Roman rule. So they revolt against Rome. Well, Rome does something very well, and that is put down revolt. And so the Romans blow into town under the leadership of a man by the name of Vespasian. They come in from the north and quickly subdue Galilee. Vespasian is called back to Rome, though, in 68 when Nero commits suicide. And they need a new Roman ruler. So Vespasian goes back to try and figure out who the new Roman ruler is going to be, and it turns out to be Vespasian. So when he is installed, he ends up appointing his son as the new leader of that army. His name is Titus. And he is the Roman general that is ultimately going to subdue Jerusalem in 70. And when he subdues Jerusalem, he does that royally. He destroys the temple. He levels the city. He captures all kinds of people and kills everyone else that he can find. Complete destruction of Jerusalem. Some of the people in the city get away, and so they leave and they head south. Those tend to be zealots, and they're going to end up at a place called Masada. But Titus is going to follow them. And so Titus is going to destroy not only Jerusalem, he's going to go, and next group he's going to kill are the Essenes, and then he's finally going to get to Masada, and will subdue that in 73. And with that ends the revolt against Rome. Titus is also going to become a Roman Caesar, and if you visit Rome, you will see that there is an arch that is devoted to Titus. And if you look at this arch, your back is right to the Colosseum. So it's really just a short distance from the Colosseum to the Arch of Titus. And why this is so significant is because it has in it, and all of the victories and other things like that are in these arches in the Roman Forum. But up here in the upper left-hand corner is a relief. And the relief is a picture of the conquest of Rome, conquest of Jerusalem. And there you see the menorah taken from the temple in Jerusalem back to Rome. Well, the last place the holdouts go is Masada, which is this fortress that was originally built by King Herod. It was sort of a summer place for King Herod. But the Zealots end up taking the top of that hill, and Rome is at the base of the hill. Rome has captured people in Jerusalem and has brought them down south, and those Jews that have been captured are going to build this earthen rampart. The Romans know that Jews on top of the hill will not, in fact, hurt the ones who are working on this rampart. It's one of the reasons why they employ Jews to build this rampart. But the rampart is there to this day. You can still see this in Israel. But Romans, in building this by Jewish labor, just as they're getting close to the top of it, notice that there is no longer smoke rising from the top of Masada. And when they breach the walls, they end up finding out that everyone in that mountain fortress has committed suicide. Rather than fall into the hands of the Romans, almost 1,000 people committed suicide. To this day, when you are sworn into the Israeli military, you're taken to the top of this particular section, of Masada. And there you commit, never again will this happen in Israel. And this is a major showcase for visitors to Israel and the like. You don't go to Israel without visiting Masada. It's a very important site. Dignitaries are brought there all the time. Tourists are there like crazy. It's a very, very important site. But I want to point out, we had these Jewish sects that before 70 CE, that diversity of Judaism doesn't last past 70. So here is a map. Here is Jerusalem. And after Titus destroys Jerusalem, levels Jerusalem, he's going to go to Jericho, which is where you have to go to get down to the valley here. He's going to go from Jericho to Qumran. From Qumran, he's going to go to Masada. And what you see when he does that, he destroys the Sadducees when he levels Jerusalem. He then wipes out the Essenes when he gets to Qumran. And then the Zealots are wiped out at Masada. So the only group to survive 70 CE are the Pharisees.
And the normal people.
And the Pharisees are the spiritual grandparents of Judaism today. Okay? Remember this. This is going to be important as we deal with these various groups before the destruction of Jerusalem. And Luke is really good about telling you what group is responsible for what thing. So listen. And then, of course, the Amharites, they're the unaffiliated. Okay, let's do the triumphal entry. You know the triumphal entry. You're all familiar with that. Jesus is coming. He has been, we saw Zacchaeus. He was in Jericho. And Jesus is coming from Jericho, which is down below sea level. He's going to go up to Jerusalem. And when you go up to Jerusalem, you go over the Mount of Olives on the eastern side, and you go down the western side into the Kidron Valley, and then you go up from the Kidron Valley to the Temple Mount, the Hakotel as it is in Hebrew. That's what Jesus is going to do. And as he's coming down, as he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives into the Kidron Valley, a whole multitude of disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, order your disciples to stop. He answered, I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. As long as they're outside of Jerusalem, those who are major voices are the Pharisees. Once he enters Jerusalem, he's no longer in Pharisaic territory. Who controls Jerusalem? The Sadducees. So, he's going to go after the triumphal entry. He is going to weep over Jerusalem. As he came near to Jerusalem, still outside, he wept over it, saying, if you had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they're hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They'll crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. To what does that refer? The destruction of Jerusalem. This is written after that's already taken place. If Luke is written in 85, the destruction of Jerusalem has already taken place in 70. And that there's a linkage between Jesus' death and the destruction of Jerusalem as a result. You had your chance, and what happened? You blew it. Weeps over Jerusalem. So he's going to go into the temple, cleanse the temple. Who controls the temple? Which group? The Sadducees. So who's he going to upset? The Sadducees. He entered the temple, began to drive out those who were selling things there. He said, it's written, my house shall be called a house of prayer. You've made it a den of robbers. Every day he was teaching in the temple. The chief priests and the scribes and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were spellbound by what they heard. Who are these people? The chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people. Those are the Sadducees. Who wants Jesus dead? The Sadducees. Why? Because he's bringing to a halt those things which they make money.
It's always a power struggle.
It is a power struggle, absolutely. And the Sadducees are there and have the benefit and the favor of Rome. Rome's given them certain powers. But they've got to make sure that revolt doesn't take place on their watch, or else they will be punished. And as it turns out, when there is revolt in 66, who's punished? The Sadducees. And they know that this time. So here's the plot to kill Jesus. Now we're going to jump ahead a couple of chapters. This is sort of the introduction to the Last Supper. Festival of Unleavened Bread, which is called the Passover, was near. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to put Jesus to death, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers of the temple police about how he might betray him to them. They were greatly pleased and agreed to give him money, so he consented and began to look for an opportunity to betray him to them when no crowd was present. Now, I don't know if you remember, but when we were back talking about the temptation of Jesus according to the Gospel of Luke, it's a very interesting passage. When the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time. And what do we find out? And Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot. So Satan now has come back into the picture. After the temptation where he is driven away, he comes back in the person of Judas. Who is upset with Jesus? Who's trying to do him in? The Sadducees. Who's going to help them? Jews. So whose side are the Sadducees on? Satan's. Well, here's the story of the Passover Seder. When the hour came, this is the Last Supper. When the hour came, Jesus took his place at the table and the apostles with him. He said to him, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. So, just a couple of quick points about the Passover Seder. Of course, you know that this commemorates the Exodus event. And you find all about this in the book of Exodus, conveniently enough, where the Israelites, although they're really technically Hebrews at this point, they're going to be called Israelites once they come out of Egypt. But the story takes place in Egypt, this meal that they have to eat hurriedly before they depart. It is celebrated at sundown on the 15th of Nisan, which is in fact the first month in the ceremonial calendar of Judaism. And it's on the 15th at sundown. In biblical tradition, days begin at sundown, not at sun up. For us, we think of a day beginning when the sun rises. Not true in ancient Judaism. So the expression in the Hebrew Bible is night and day, not day and night. Night and day. Night precedes day. So this begins the 15th of Nisan. Actually, it's Nisan. I was corrected. It's like the car company, Nisan. We know as a result of this the day that Jesus dies. What is it? 15th of Nisan. Because everything, this is the beginning of the day, he's going to be crucified and dead and buried before sundown on the next day, 16th. All of that takes place on the 15th. Even for us, it's Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. In biblical chronology, that's all one day.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
Well, the meal itself consists of lamb, bitter herbs, parsley, salt water, unleavened bread, and wine. But it is important to point out that lamb was a part of the first century celebration. But once the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, lamb has never been eaten at Passover since. There's often a lamb shank, a lamb bone that is on the Passover table. But you never eat lamb on that day. Most of the time you would eat chicken. You'll get some other kind of meat, and it normally is chicken that you get. But since the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, lamb is no longer a part of the Passover meal. The other thing is that in Jesus' day, Passover was a pilgrim feast. You traveled to Jerusalem, and there in Jerusalem you purchased a lamb rather than having to drag it from home. You purchased one there. Then you had it killed at the temple, and then you took it home and prepared it. After the destruction of the temple, there was no place to take it, to have it sacrificed, so Passover became an affair in your home. And it's celebrated to this day in your home, not in a synagogue. You have this meal in your house. And you invite others, because you're supposed to consume the whole lamb, or the whole main dish. You invite others to participate, to help with this meal. So it's a community meal, but it's held in private homes, not in religious sanctuaries. Okay, well, here's the Last Supper in the Gospel of Luke. And this is the interesting thing, I think, about Luke's Gospel, Luke's version of this. And one of the reasons why there are all kinds of scriptural, there are varying readings on this particular account. It begins, Jesus took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves, for I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." Okay? Well, that's odd, because everyone knows that the Last Supper begins with bread. You drink the wine to wash down the bread. That's how it's easy to remember that. So you always have the bread first. Well, that's not what Luke says. He's got wine here. And then he goes on to say, he took a loaf of bread, and that's wrong. Even the New Revised Standard says a loaf of bread. It's not a loaf of bread because it's unleavened bread. It's flat. It's a cracker. He took bread, and that's what it says in the Greek. He took bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it, gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Well, scribes encountered this, and they said, well, that's weird. That's just wrong. That's the reverse order of what we know. And so they dropped out, even though they did all kinds of things with this. There's another reference to a cup after supper. And oftentimes they would drop that out because we know there are not two cups. This is the wrong order, but having this shows that this is really wrong because it's another cup. He did the same with the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is poured out for you as the new covenant in my blood. But see, the one who betrays me is with me, and his hand is on the table. For the Son of Man is going as has been determined, but woe to him by whom he is betrayed." And they began to ask one another which one of them it would be who would do this. Strange. Well, actually, this is one of the reasons why I think Luke probably was Jewish. Even though everyone talks about Luke as being a Gentile, this shows that, in fact, Luke was aware that multiple cups of wine are drunk at Passover. This cup, and in Jesus' day, there were 3 cups of wine they think that were drunk. Today, you drink 4, and they're healthy cups. It's not like our communion thing where you get this little sort of taste. No, you drink a real cup of wine 4 times in today's Passover meal. Probably 3 here, but this is one before. This cup is the cup after supper. And that's distinguished from one that's during the meal. This is after supper. And so this is the bread. This here is the communion part. And the author of Luke has put it into context of other drinking of wine and other eating that's going on at the time. After that, Jesus is going to go out to the sermon, out to the mount. He's going to go to the Mount of Olives, which, again, the Hakotel here, which is the Temple Mount where he is. He's going to go down into the Kidron Valley and up on the western side of the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives has, very conveniently, olive trees. And so the Garden of Gethsemane is an olive area. So if you go there today, you will see an olive grove, olive trees, and you can be in the Garden of Gethsemane, which I'm sure is not the real Garden of Gethsemane, but every guide that you ever have in Israel will tell you this is exactly where Jesus stood when he gave the Sermon on the Mount, and this is exactly where Jesus held the Last Supper, and I keep thinking to myself, it's probably not exactly the right spot, but it's not far from where it happened. So you get a sense of what sort of this Garden of Gethsemane might look like today, even though that's probably not the Garden of Gethsemane. But what I didn't realize is how odd olive trees are. Olive trees are these gnarly trees that don't grow high, but they grow wide and then dense. So you get these branches that really sort of intertwine from these various trees. And the result is that when you're standing under olive trees, you can't see the sky. It's really, really dark under that canopy. And that's why Judas is going to have to come up and grab Jesus. They're trying to feel their way in the dark to find where Jesus is, and they need Judas to point out. And he needs to point out by, in fact, embracing. Well, before this happens, Jesus is going to pray, "Father, if it's your will, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but thy will be done." This is unique to the Gospel of Luke. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down from the ground, down on the ground. When he got up for prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. I would modify that. It's probably because of the wine that they drank rather than the grief that they're experiencing that they passed out in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Well, here's the betrayal. While he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you're betraying the Son of Man?" And a kiss in the ancient world would have been a full embrace and a mouth-to-mouth kiss. This was not a peck on the cheek or whatever. Men greeted men with kisses, and they would embrace. You would never do that. A man would never do that in public with a woman. But it was acceptable for men to do that with men, and that's what Judas does. Judas wraps up Jesus and kisses him on the lips. And he says, "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with the sword?" Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said no more of this, and he touched his ear and healed him. So here is the last miracle that Jesus is going to perform according to the Gospel of Luke. And Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers, the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you didn't lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." So Jesus allows himself to be arrested. This is really important in the biblical tradition. Jesus is not taken by force. Jesus gives himself up. This is the Father's will, and so he does what his Father requires. Who arrests him, though? Oftentimes people think it's the Romans who arrest him. No. Who? It's the chief priests, and it's the temple police who work for the chief priests. Those are Sadducees. So he's going to go now before the council. Not going to be tried that night. In Luke's gospel, they're going to wait until the morning. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They're the major voice of the council, so I guess it really is their council. What they decide is going to be decided. There was some Pharisaic representation on the council, but that was a minor voice. It's the Sadducees' council. They said, "If you're the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of power of God." And all of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" And he said, "You say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." The charge here is a charge of blasphemy. Watch what happens when Jesus is taken to Pilate. Chief priests and scribes again. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. Pilate is the governor. He is not a ruler, but he is a Roman-appointed governor of this region. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "One, I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." Let me point out that the charge coming from the Sanhedrin is blasphemy. That's not anything Pilate is in any way interested. Pilate wants to know if he's a king. Are you the king of the Jews? King of the Jews is a title that was given to King Herod by Roman senatorial decree in 40 BCE. And so Pilate wants to know, are you the king of the Jews? Because I know who has been appointed king of the Jews down through the years, and I don't know you. Okay? But more importantly, notice what Pilate says to the chief priests and the crowds. I find no basis for an accusation against this man. Watch how you're going to see how Roman officials are going to bend over backwards to declare Jesus innocent. And yet Jesus ends up on a Roman cross. Watch this. Here's the first. I find no basis for an accusation against this man. Well, when Pilate hears that he's from Galilee, that gives Pilate an idea. I'm going to send him to the person who rules Galilee. And that is a man by the name of Herod Antipas. He's a son of King Herod the Great. Here's Herod the Great's kingdom. And when Herod the Great died in 4 BCE, it was divided among various sons. Archelaus, one of the sons, got Samaria and Judea, southern portion. He was even worse than his father was, and therefore he is, in fact, kicked out of office by the Romans, and it's from that point on when Rome is going to appoint governors over this region. On the other hand, Herod Antipas, another son, is going to get Galilee and Perea, these two areas here. One on the western bank, one on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. Okay? Because Jesus is from Galilee, he is legitimately under the control of Herod Antipas. And so Pilate is going to send him to Herod Antipas, who happens to be in town at that time. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean, and when he heard that when he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod Antipas, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. So now he's going to have a second trial before a second Roman authority. When Herod Antipas saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he'd been wanting to see him for a long time because he heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. They put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. So you have a second Roman ruler who is going to say Jesus is innocent. And we'll see that. That's going to be stated, in fact, by Pilate. Jesus comes back to Pilate. Pilate then called together again the chief priests, the leaders of the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is perverting the people, and I've examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and released him." Okay? Who again, Sadducees behind all of this, according to Luke.
That's interesting. He didn't find any reason to do anything about flogging, just in case.
He's going to flog him. Well,
You got here, so we'll flog you.
Our Roman soldiers have nothing better to do. We need something for him to do. And they all shouted together, "Away with this fellow, release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed over Jesus as they wished. My friends, that makes absolutely no sense. We have heard that read so many times, we don't see the absurdity of that situation. You have Pilate that is trying to keep a rein on things. Jerusalem at the time of Passover grew in size by about 4 times. People from all over came to Jerusalem. It was a hotbed. And so what Pilate is going to do, he's going to release someone who is an insurrectionist and guilty of murder. He's going to release that person and crucify someone who has done nothing wrong? That makes no sense. Yes?
I've never thought about this before, but was Barnabas an insurrectionist against Rome or against, like, the Sadducees?
No. He was a Roman revolution. I mean, he's a revolutionary against Rome. And he was found guilty of murder, too. And so those are the kinds of people that Rome definitely wanted to keep an eye on. And so Pilate's just going to release this guy. And he's admitted on 3 occasions Jesus has done absolutely nothing to deserve this. And the other absurdity about it is that Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. The Romans hated the Jews. Why would they anyway give any concession to Rome? Why would he give any concession to the Jews? Why would he allow himself to be manipulated by the Jews? That makes no sense. Rome, as I say, many occasions, Rome is like that 500-pound elephant. Where does the 500-pound elephant sit? Anywhere it wants to. And that's what Rome went. Rome did what Rome wanted to do. But Rome sure didn't do stupid things like this. Why would you kill someone that had done nothing wrong and release someone who clearly had done a lot wrong into a situation that is a hotbed of foment of discontent? The problem is, what happens in the New Testament is that all of the gospel writers end up lessening Roman responsibility. Jesus ends up on a Roman cross, but the Romans claim Jesus is guiltless. Why does the New Testament want to say that Jesus is guiltless? Why do they not want to blame Rome? Clearly, you don't live in the Roman Empire, right? You don't go around blaming Rome that could smash you like a bug. And so the authors are very, very, very careful to make sure that Rome isn't implicated. And I'll show you another example. This is, I'm going to jump to, I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to jump to Acts really quickly. And you've got to get through 22 chapters to get to this point. But Acts is the longest book in the New Testament. At the end of it, Paul is going to be arrested. He's going to be arrested when he shows up in Jerusalem, and the Jews are going to oppose him there. He's brought a collection from Gentiles that he's going to give to poor Jewish believers in Jerusalem. And such a riot breaks out that he's taken into protective custody, and he is shipped to Caesarea Maritima, which is on the coast. And he is kept in prison there for 2 years by the governor, who's at this time named Felix. Felix listens to him, but doesn't really act. He just lets him rot in prison for a couple of years until a new governor comes. That's a man by the name of Festus. And then Festus listens to Paul's defense. So Paul's defended himself before the people in Jerusalem. He's defended himself before the governor Felix. He's defended himself before Festus, and Festus can't find out any reason why he's still in prison, but doesn't want to release him. So he calls another Roman official, King Herod Agrippa II. And he wants him to hear Paul and help him make a decision. And so after all of these Romans have listened to Paul, notice what it says at the end of chapter 26. Then the king, King Herod II, got up, and with him the governor, Festus, and Bernice, and those who'd been seated with them. And as they were leaving, they said to one another, "This man is doing nothing to deserve death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to the emperor." Paul, in his defense here, claims that he is a Roman citizen. And so when he appears before Felix, he says, "I appeal to the Roman governor. I appeal to the Roman emperor. As a Roman citizen, my case can be heard by Caesar, and I appeal to him." And so he ends up getting sent to Caesar because of his own request. Rome doesn't think he should go. Rome would have released him, so now they're blaming Paul for Paul dying. They're bending over backwards to make sure that Rome isn't implicated in the death of any of these people. It's got to be someone else responsible. Well, when you lessen Roman responsibility for Jesus' death, who ends up sharing, or who ends up having the lion's share of the responsibility? Jews. And which Jews? Which Jews? The Sanhedrin. And what do we know about the Sanhedrin? They were gone at the time that Luke wrote. So Luke has blamed a group that no longer exists. But when we don't know that those are different groups in the New Testament, we read it as the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. And I want to point out, and I do this in every class, so I'm sorry if you've heard this from me before, but the very fact is the Romans killed Jesus. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. No doubt. How do we know this? Well, we know it for a number of reasons. First of all, Jesus was crucified. There is not a bit of evidence that Jesus died any other way than by crucifixion, and crucifixion was a Roman form of punishment. Jews never crucified. If Jesus had been guilty of blasphemy, as we read earlier, the Jews would have stoned him. And then people say, if you've read John, John says, well, we don't have the ability to kill anyone. And I would simply say, then you haven't read the story of Acts where Stephen is stoned for blasphemy. So they certainly were able to kill people. Jesus is not stoned by the Jews because blasphemy is not what got him crucified. What got him crucified was, in fact, this notion of being king of the Jews. And king of the Jews is, as I indicated, that is a Roman inscription. It's a Roman charge. That's what Herod the Great was, the king of the Jews. And that title, given to Herod the Great in 40 BCE, is clearly a Roman title because Jews didn't call themselves Jews. Jews is a non-Jewish term for Israelites or Hebrews. So Paul doesn't say, I'm a Jew. He says, I'm an Israelite. I'm a Hebrew, born of Hebrews. Okay? Rome killed Jesus. Now I'm going to just go over this quickly. I've done this before too, but I just want to go over some crucifixion facts. That in fact, the crucifixion is a Roman form of punishment, that it was not invented by the Romans. It was perfected by them, though. They did thousands and thousands of crucifixions, and it wasn't until Constantine was elected or appointed the new Roman emperor in the middle of the early years of the 4th century. Constantine was a Christian, and he declared an end to crucifixion. And it's at that point in history that the cross then becomes a symbol of Christianity. Prior to this time, when crucifixion is still a live option for death, it's not a symbol of Christianity. The fish was. The fish sign was. But not the cross. It's only after. It's outlawed in the early 4th century. The purpose of crucifixion was not to kill, but to prolong death, to get the person to beg to be put out of their misery. Only males were crucified. It was only done for serious crimes. It took place in very public places. And the person being crucified was always stripped naked. And finally, it began with the flogging. The flogging I've showed you before was done with a cat of nine tails. This device that had pieces of bone and chips of wood and glass embedded in the ends of those strips of wood that were bound together with a leather handle. And the person would be tied to a post and then would be whipped across the back, and very quickly would just open up the back, the buttocks, the thighs, the chest area, the stomach, all of that would be just laid open. And the purpose of that was to get the juices flowing so that with this great loss of blood, your blood sugar drops and you can't resist. You don't have any strength to resist. And once you're pliable enough, then you're ready to be crucified. But just to make sure you didn't have any energy left, they would make you carry your cross to the site of execution. And you would carry the crossbar, not the upright as you often see in movies and the like. You don't drag the whole thing through. The upright would already be located someplace, usually in a very high hill. Golgotha was a hill because this was deterrence. This was ancient deterrence. They wanted people to see what would happen to you if you messed with Rome. So crucifixions were done in very public places. Sometimes they were done along the main roads into town. And you would have to walk between these bodies hanging on crosses before you got into town. And by the time you got to town, you were a law-abiding citizen. You had learned the lesson very clearly that you needed to obey the law. Well, Jesus can't carry his cross, according to the New Testament, because of how severely he was beaten. And he's not on the cross all that long, which is another indication of how severely beaten he was during the flogging stage. Sometimes people were killed at this stage. This was not intended to kill, but sometimes the centurions were a little too aggressive and they ended up killing the people here. If you got to the site of execution, you were thrown down on the ground and you were pinned. Your arms were pinned down first. And then nails were driven through your hands, and then that crossbar would be lifted up and put on another upright, and then your feet would be nailed as well. I guess I don't say. I'll say a little bit more about that then. No. Let me do this. So, some Jews had a hand in Jesus' demise. Yes, that seems to be the case, but what Jews were those? Those were the Sadducees. And we know the Sadducees were destroyed with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. And the connection's already been made between those who try to do Jesus in and God's retribution on them, which is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. Bill.
Okay, Sadducees are dead. But it's about 40 to 60 years after Christ died.
Right.
Romans still are in charge. They're still violently putting down this uprising.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So why wouldn't you say it's the Sadducees? If you said it was anybody else, Luke and all the writers would be gone in a heartbeat.
What I'm saying is that we don't distinguish those groups when we read it today.
Correct.
And so it seems like we just sort of blanketly blame Jews for this.
But Luke, in doing his writing, that's going to be published, albeit slowly by today's standards. But people will find out who the writer is, and he'd be setting himself up to be killed by.
He never identifies himself.
Yeah, well, we've identified.
He doesn't.
We've identified him, so I can't believe that the Romans couldn't if they wanted to.
There's no name attached to any of the Gospels.
I
And that's
understand that.
also protection.
Yeah.
You got to be very careful when you live in that kind of society about what you write. I'm starting a series on Revelation, which I've done here. I'm starting that next week, and that's part of what Revelation is about. The reason it's such highly imaginative writing is that you can't criticize Rome without jeopardizing your own life. So you use other terminology, and that's what they do, other imagery, other terminology, to say Rome is wrong and Rome is going to die. It won't die for another 4 or 5 centuries, but it's going to die. Okay, let me continue here. We're on our way to Golgotha. So they sees a man, Simon of Cyrene, coming in because Jesus can't carry his cross. Again, Jesus is going to talk about 7. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children, for the days are coming. They'll say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us, for if they did this when the wood is green, what will they do when it is dry? Again, a reference to 7. Then we have the crucifixion of Jesus. 2 others also were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself, for if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, this is the king of the Jews. What is not a part of this and what is covered up is a passage that is not a part of the original Gospel of Luke, but historically has been inserted. And that is, then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. That appears in later manuscripts, but not in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke that we have. That sounds much more like what is said by Stephen in the stoning of Stephen in Acts. But that gets read back into the story of Jesus, which is not present. Now we know what the crucifixion is like because we've all seen pictures of it. This tends to be a Roman Catholic view. Here's the Greek Orthodox view of the crucifixion. And so we really have not known what crucifixion was like until the 20th century. In the 20th century, there was excavation done in Jerusalem, and the remains of a person who had been crucified uncovered. And based on those skeletal remains, we have a better sense of what crucifixion involved. Here is what was found. It's much smaller than this, but you can see that there is a nail with a hook at the end. It was believed for so long that only Jesus was nailed to a cross, a special punishment for Jesus. Evidently, that's not the case. Nailing must have been fairly common. And this person was nailed, and it must have hit, the nail must have hit a knot in the wood and bent. And so when they pulled the man's body off the cross, they couldn't get the nail out, so they just buried it with the nail. The other skeletal remains give us an idea of how that nailing took place and where the nails were inserted. My daughter is a pathologist, and so she has shown me what I'm looking at here. This is the top right here. And so what you're seeing are the beginnings of the toe bones here, and you see a nail going through the heel bones, not through the top of the feet, as you often see depicted in crucifixions. Here is another picture. This is what was found, another sort of mock-up of that. This is what it would have looked like going through the heel of someone. A board was always placed over and a nail driven through the board. So you see a little piece here of acacia wood, which is the wood that would have been used, put over, and so blood wouldn't splurt out in your eye when you nailed through, and it was easier to nail through wood than flesh. So that's what you see happening here. But in light of that, these are different crucifixion pictures or positions. You can see that in this case, the lower body was twisted and a nail driven through the heel bones in this direction. In the one on this side, on the right, you can see that the legs are crossed, ankles are sort of crossed, where the feet are crossed, and then a single nail driven through the heel bones of those two. What's also interesting is that you don't have a cross shape. The upright would have been upright, and the crossbar piece would have had a notch in it, and you would lift that up and put it on the notch of the upright, so it will slip over and be in place. And people say, well, the charge is supposed to be put over his head. So that's why it's nailed up there, isn't it, on the cross? Well, scholars think over his head means it's like a necklace, that you put it over someone's head and it hangs on their chest so people can see it. If it's so high up, you can't read it. If it's down here, sort of at eye level, people know exactly what you're being crucified for. And then we have the story of the penitent criminal in Luke's account. In Matthew and Mark, there are two people, Matthew and in Mark, there are two criminals that are crucified with him, both of them abuse him. Not this one. And even this man claims that Jesus has done nothing wrong. So this criminal attests to Jesus' innocence. And then when Jesus dies, notice what the centurion says. Having said this, he breathed